Good morning. Beautiful morning outside, isn't it? Gotta love this weather. It is absolutely beautiful. This time of year, it is deer season has hit. October starts bow season, and of course, rifle season will start there in November. And I was thinking the other day about one of my earliest hunting experiences, one of the earliest memories that I have in hunting, and it was down in South Texas with my grandpa and my brother, and I believe my cousin Adam was also there. And when we were 9 years old, each one of us were able to shoot our first deer. Well, we had the choice between a black buck, a fallow, a whitetail, and my choice was a black buck. Well, Grandpa got me ready, right? He takes me out and we get on the range and we do a lot of shooting. And I get everything, sighted in, and I'm good. I'm hitting the target pretty well, and he gets me ready, and he explains everything, right? This is what you need to look for. You need a good broadside shot. This is how you do it. Here's where you aim, all the details. Well, me and Grandpa and Jay, and I believe Adam, we load up in the Suburban or Bronco, whichever it was, and we take off, and we get ready to go on this hunt. And we come across this really good-looking black buck antelope. And we get in line where we have a pretty decent angle on it, and I approach, I get set up and I'm getting ready to take my shot. Well, the deer kind of turned a little bit and it wasn't on the best angle, and Grandpa says, well, if you have a good shot, take it, but if it's not a good shot, don't take it. Well, I went ahead and I took the shot. I hit this deer in the hind end on the first shot. I hit him back here in the rump on the first shot, and he takes off running, and we get caught up to this deer, and he's laying down, and Grandpa says, okay, well, shoot him again. There he is, right? And we're up real close, and I pull the gun up, and all I see is hair. I can't even tell what I'm aiming at. And I take another shot, and I hit him right in the neck. And I blew a big old hole in his neck. Well, Grandpa and Granny actually had that deer mounted for me for my birthday, and I still have that deer hanging in my living room till this day. And honestly, I don't know if they might have had to shoot another deer, because I blew such a big hole in that deer's neck, they might have had to shoot another one to actually have that deer mounted. But I look back, and that's been over 30 years ago, and I look back and I'm like, man, I really could have done a lot of things different on that first hunt. You see, if I would have been a little bit more patient, I would have saw that, this deer is actually quartering away very hard. And it's really a difficult shot. I mean, I was looking at its hind end, and then I could see its belly coming out, and then I could see its shoulder. And Grandpa said, if it's not a good shot, don't take the shot. And I kind of reacted on impulse. I was like, oh man, here's my chance. Here's my deer. I want this shot. And I took the shot where I probably should have waited. I should have been a little bit more patient and waited for that deer to turn and get broadside, and I would have had a better angle. Well, even in going and getting that second shot, we get up there and we're like 20 yards from this deer. And Grandpa says, well, take your shot. Go ahead and finish him, right? Well, I pulled my gun up and all I saw was a blob of hair. If I would have slowed down just a little bit, instead of reacting on impulse, and realized, my scope's still on 9 power, right? And this deer's at 20 yards. So when I pull the scope up, all I see is a big patch of hair. If I would have turned my scope down to 3 power, right, I would have been able to see what I was aiming at. And I could have got a shot that didn't ruin any of the meat or ruin the whole front neck of this deer. I could have made a better shot. Well, a lot of the times we relate missing the mark to sin, right? There are so many things I could have done differently where I probably could have made a better shot and not missed the mark. Not once, but twice. Well, in our Christian walk, just the same, there are times where I think maybe we react in impulse. We react before we think the situation through clearly. And rather than examining the whole of the situation, sometimes we just respond, and in doing that, ultimately, we miss the mark. We fall short of the glory of God. Well, I'm reminded even of Genesis 39, and a prime example of an individual who did not miss the mark. And I think part of it is because he clearly examined the entire situation. You think about Joseph in Genesis chapter 39 and how he really considers the situation, and he looks at everything that's going on, and ultimately he continues to maintain his loyalty to God. Well, when we miss the mark, when we sin, we're turning our loyalty away from God, and we're turning our focus to things of this world, and they distract us, if you will, in the moment. And we react and we behave on impulse. I think if you consider even Joseph, in this narrative in Genesis 39, And you think about what Potiphar's wife tries to do to him. I think we would say, yes, he is clearly a loyal individual. He's loyal to God. He's loyal to Potiphar, but he's also loyal to God. And I think part of that is because he really examines the situation. It's not really said exactly how he goes through some of the things that he endures and continues to maintain his loyalty to God, but we have to imply that he does maintain his loyalty because God never leaves him. He continues to be with him. And I want us to consider, as it means to be loyal, some things, even some scenarios where we must be loyal to God. If you look at the first 2 verses, even in Genesis chapter 39, it says, "Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him down there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he was a successful man. And he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian." Now, you think about this scenario and where it is that Joseph has found himself. If he's truly going to be able to be loyal despite what he does not have, the same is said to us. Be loyal despite what you don't have. And think about this scenario. Everything that Joseph has been taken away from him. Yet he still sees the situation clearly. Remember, even prior to this narrative, it was his own brothers who conspire against him, and they say, you know what, we're envious of this individual. We hate our own brother, essentially, and they want to kill him. And luckily, because of Reuben, given the opportunity to kill Joseph, Reuben says, look, we don't need to go that far with this. But he says, no, let's cast him into the pit. So they throw him in a pit. Now, his own brothers have turned against him completely. His whole world is turned upside down, and I can only imagine at how he feels in this given moment. How would you feel? How would you see this situation? How quick would we be to turn against God and to drop our loyalty to Him in a given situation like this, thinking the whole world has turned against us? Do you think he had ever felt more desolate at any given point in his life? More alone? More abandoned? Even the verse that was just read for us out of Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 5. Let your conduct be without covetousness. Be content with such things as you have. For he himself said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. Does it still imply, even in a situation like this where everybody turns against you, you're sold into slavery? Be content with those things which you have, and trust and know that he will never leave you nor forsake you. That would be quite a challenge in this situation. But I think he obviously sees it somewhat clearly, because even as you go to verse 2, it says that the Lord was with Joseph. You see, I think he even recognized and was clear as it relates to his relationship with God. Even in this situation, he didn't lose sight of who God is. He didn't lose sight of who had actually turned against him. And ultimately, in a scenario like this, if you think about it, it's going to be one of two things. You're either going to have the mind of that of Job, where you say, okay, the good Lord gives and the good Lord takes away, right? Job chapter 1 and verse 21. Or you're going to have the mindset of Job's wife, curse God and die. But in this scenario, it seems that Joseph still sees his relationship with God clearly. What would it take for you to say you are successful? Did you see that in verse 2? It says, the Lord was with Joseph and he was a successful man. What would it take for you to say, I'm successful? Is it material gains? Is it a house with a wife and two kids, a boy and a girl? Is it the American dream? Is it something of that nature? Is that what you would say is success in life? Consider where he's at. He has nothing. We can't even say that he has the clothes on his back. Remember, his brothers stole his tunic that his father had given him. They covered it in blood and took it back to their dad and said he must have been eaten by a wild beast. He has absolutely nothing, yet he is still successful because of his relationship with God. And in everything that he does not have, he has absolutely nothing, and he is still loyal to God. I'm reminded of Romans chapter 8. Verses 35 through 37. The question being asked, what shall separate us from the love of God? Famine, persecution, sickness, or sword? Is anything going to separate us from the love of God? He says, we are counted as sheep for the slaughter all the day long. Yet we're more than conquerors. You think about even in 2 Corinthians chapter 4 and verse 9, it says, persecuted but not forsaken, struck down but not destroyed. You could easily say he's sold into Egyptian slavery, but not forsaken. He recognizes the situation. He sees it clearly. He sees his relationship with God clearly. And he did not, even in all of this that he has lost, turn away from his loyalty to God. I think that would be quite a challenge. But it goes even beyond that. Consider even verses 3 through 6. It's one thing to continue to maintain your loyalty to God despite what you don't have, but also to maintain your loyalty despite what you do have. Look at the transition and how things take place now for Joseph. Look at verse 3 and following. It says, and his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all he did prosper in his hand. So Joseph found favor in his sight and served him. Then he made him overseer of his house, and all that he had he put under his authority. So it was from the time that he had made him overseer of his house and all that he had, that the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. And the blessings of the Lord was on all that he had in the house and in the field. Thus he left all that he had in Joseph's hand, and he did not know what he had except for the bread which he ate. Now, Joseph has gone from the very bottom of the barrel, essentially. He was probably at a low that he had never experienced at any other point in his life when his brothers sold him off into slavery. They completely abandoned him, threw him into this pit, and sold him to the first man passing. And now here he is at the peak, right? Now, he maintained his loyalty through all of that, and you're going to see that he maintains his loyalty even at the greatest highs that he experiences directly after all that happened to him. Now, I would assume, and I think it's right to assume, even still, Joseph has a right relationship with God. You see, he has a right relationship with God, and he sees his blessings clearly. I don't think it's any fault to assume that Joseph was a right or a devout man. We know throughout the history of the Old Testament and even going into the New Testament, when an individual is labeled as one who is righteous, one who is a devout individual, the blessings of God are abundant in his life. We see that God is still with Joseph. We have to assume, and I think rightly so, that he continues to maintain his loyalty to God. And we recognize that even Potiphar, he's blessed so abundantly that Potiphar even recognizes, man, this guy is surely blessed. I'm going to put everything that I have in his hands. I'm going to let him control all these things, and so much so that not only Potiphar's house is blessed because of that, but even all of his fields. How easy would it have been for Joseph to begin to get just a little bit prideful in this sense? You know, I'm reminded even the psalm we studied not too long ago, Psalm chapter 1, and Psalm 1, in verse 3. Talking about that plant or that tree that's planted by the rivers of water, that it continues to grow, it's going to continue to give all of its fruit in its season, right? That its leaf will not wither, and all that he does will prosper. Well, that's Joseph. Everything that he lays his hands on prospers. But he sees his blessings clearly. He recognizes exactly where these blessings come from, and then he sees himself clearly. Again, I would ask, how easy would it be to be so prosperous, to immediately turn your attention away from God and say, look at the success story of my life. Look at what I've been able to do, and eventually become somewhat prideful, and all of a sudden you lose sight of where the blessings actually come from. You know Uzziah, one of the kings that's found in 2 Kings? God blessed him abundantly. And he allowed him to build up this great army and this great add-ons to the city, if you will, and all of these things are going really well for Uzziah, and all of a sudden in the text it says this, it says, when his heart was lifted up, it was to his own destruction. He began to look at all the things that he had accomplished, that God allowed him to accomplish, and he thought more about himself and his own success story. And he turned his attention away from God, and I can't help but to think, you think even Joseph in this situation, how hard would it be? Yeah, I went from the bottom of the barrel and now I'm at the top of the mountaintop. But yet he still has God on his side, essentially. He's still being loyal unto God. He recognizes where the blessings come from. So much so that they are seen even through everything that he lays his hands on. Now, this next section, you look at the next section, verses 7 through 9, and if you're thinking about the loyalty of Joseph, this is where we always go. This is where we recognize Joseph to be a loyal man, and the idea is be loyal despite what you could have. Look at verses 7 through 9. It says, "And it came to pass after these things that his master's wife cast longing eyes on Joseph. And she said, 'Lie with me.' But he refused and said to his master's wife, 'Look, my master does not know what is with me in the house, and he has committed all that he has to my hand. There is no one greater in this house than I, nor has he kept back anything from me but you, because you are his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?'" He has been loyal to God even when he had nothing. He has remained loyal to God even when he now has everything, and everything is under his control. And now he's going to continue to remain loyal to God even when he recognizes one thing that he cannot have. You see, he sees the temptation clearly. And this might be one of those points where temptation is at its greatest. When you're considering something in life that you're not supposed to have. When you're considering something that you do not have, and that allurement there, that enticement is there to try whatever it is. Now, would it be even something that should be mentioned that Joseph is probably around the age of about 17 to 20 years old at this point? How great of a temptation would this be for this young man? He has everything else in the house. Everything has been put into his hands. Yet he recognizes clearly what the temptation is. He says, "How can I do this? How can I sin against Potiphar? But ultimately, even greater, how can I sin against God?" He recognizes exactly what it is that she is trying to do. How often is it, you think, that people find themselves in a temptation, even if it's not one as great as this? And they say, you know what? Everyone sins. Everyone falls short of the glory of God from time to time. And it's almost like we use that as a crutch, right? Everybody's going to fall short. It happens. If we get that kind of thinking in our minds in a scenario even like that, do you think that will affect our judgment? Oh, everybody makes mistakes. No, he recognizes it for what it is. He turns away from it immediately. He does not even give any thought to the temptation. You see, however great or small the sin or the temptation is, it's our responsibility to see it just the same. See the temptation clearly. Avoid it at all costs. And ultimately, see the way out clearly. Now, depending on the temptation, it's not always as easy to spot the way out so easily. But we know that God is just and he will provide for us a way out as long as we're actually looking for that way out. 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 13. That we're not going to be overtaken if we are consistently looking for that escape. God's going to provide that escape. Now, in this instance, even if you go down to about verse 12, you're going to see that he exited the building in track star form in a dead sprint, running, elbows going. He's moving out the front door, right? That's how he avoided this sin. It may be the case. We might have to do the same. Would you be embarrassed to actually run away from sin? This man looked like a track star. You know, we were in Little Leagues. I remember, I think it was Nate Doss. He told my dad, one of the guys was rounding the bases, and he told him, he said, he's tipping Coach Hammond. And Pops looked at him, he said, "What do you mean tipping?" He said, "He's tipping on his toes. He's up on his toes, and he's rounding them bases." I can only see Joseph as he's tipping. He's up on his toes, and he's in a dead sprint, and he is running from Potiphar's wife. He is getting away from this sin because he sees the temptation clearly. But not only that, he sees the way out that God has provided. And he's not going to hang around to take any chances. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where you recognize the temptation for what it is? And then you think, you know what, how long can I hang around? How close can I get to it? Can I continue to stay right here beside it without actually stepping over that line and falling into sin? Let me ask you, if your heart's of that state, do you think God looks down and sees your heart and that questioning, how close can I get to it? Do you think that's pleasing? He ran from it. In a dead sprint, he ran from the sin. That's how serious it was. And maybe that's what we need to do, right? We might look like we're absolutely crazy, but when we come up on a temptation, we just immediately bolt and we run. People might look at us like we're absolutely crazy, but guess what? We would avoid it. We would get as far away from it at all cost. He saw the temptation clearly. He saw the way out clearly. And the one thing that he was not supposed to have, he recognized. He said, that's not for me. I'm not going to have that. That is your wife. That is not mine. Continue on in the text. Verses 20 and 21. Be loyal despite what you could lose. Now this is a unique circumstance that he finds himself in. He's been all the way to the top, right? He started at the bottom. He made his way to the top. Now Potiphar's wife has cast longing eyes on him and tried to get him to lie with her, and he rejected that. And even in the text, when he took off running, she's holding on to his garment, if you will, and he runs smooth out of his clothes. Well, ultimately what she does is she holds on to those clothes, and when Potiphar comes back, she says, look, this Hebrew that you brought into the house, this slave that you brought into the house, he came and he tried to make a pass at me. So Potiphar says, well, we're going to have to do something about this. Now, we have to make sure that even as it relates, that we see consequence clearly. The wages of sin are death, right? Romans chapter 6 and verse 23. Do you know what the consequence of this type of sin would have been even in that time? It would have likely been death. Ultimately, more likely, that would have been what would have happened to Joseph if he had committed the sin that Potiphar's wife claimed he had committed. It would have been death. But it's kind of unique that Potiphar does not put him to death, but rather he puts him in jail. And I think part of that is because he recognized the character. I think he recognized what kind of man Joseph was. You know, sometimes even when I look at this text, I question whether or not Potiphar truly believed his wife. But he had to take action. He had to do something. But if we truly see the consequence clearly, even in a situation like this, we're talking about consequence. Now look, Joseph didn't even do anything wrong. Yet he's the one who's going to be cast off into prison. Right back down to the bottom of the barrel where he started at the beginning of this chapter. What would you do? We're not given some of this information as it pertains to Joseph and how he handled these situations. But it's almost like he just handled these in stride. He just took the blows and he kept on going. But he never once allowed it to change his character or change who he was. He continued to maintain his loyalty to God. He continued to maintain his character and his conduct that God would have him to have. And I find that absolutely fascinating. In this section, when somebody has accused him of something that he did not do, and it's going to cost him and put him in jail, in prison for some 2 years. I don't know about y'all, I might have wanted to retaliate. I might have got pretty angry. I might have lashed out. I might have done a lot of things, and Joseph takes it in stride and he continues to move forwards. But he never once changes who he is. And I think part of that is because he sees God's mercy clearly. You see, yes, Potiphar has now placed him in prison. But yet he still sees God's mercy shining down on him. You look at verse 21. Look at verse 20 and 21 of chapter 39. It says, Then Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, a place where the king's prisoners were confined. And he was there in prison, but the Lord was with Joseph, and he showed him mercy. I don't know if you've ever noticed that as you move through chapter 39, but all the way back in verse 2, even when we recognize him in his greatest depth of low, verse 2 says the Lord was still with Joseph. Then when he is exalted in Potiphar's house, even in verse 3 it says the Lord was with him. Verse 5, the blessings of the Lord are continuing to be upon Joseph, even to the point of all the things of Potiphar. Even when he goes into prison in verse 21, in verse 21 it says, and the Lord was still with Joseph and showed him mercy. Now, going back even to temptations and sin in the lives that we live, those scenarios where we might respond a little bit out of compulsive or just not, thinking through the situation clearly, and all of a sudden we find ourselves reacting before we actually think and look about everything that's going on. I can't help but to come back to him, and I look and I was like, what is it that's different about Joseph? How did he do all this and continue to maintain his loyalty to God? I don't know if it was a straight focus on the mercy of God, recognizing, look, yes, my brothers put me here, but God has not left me nor forsaken me. He will always be with me. I think about Paul, the thorn in the flesh, how badly he wanted that thorn removed. He prayed to God about it. My grace is sufficient. Do you suppose even that Joseph might have prayed to God, please let me out of this prison? I didn't even do anything wrong. My grace is sufficient. You see, he saw God's grace clearly. In every situation that he found himself in, I can't help but to think that he examined it thoroughly. That he continued to look at every aspect of every situation that he found himself in, and he maintained his loyalty because he saw things clearly. At the end of the day, we have this life to live, and guess what? There's going to be highs. There's going to be lows. And sometimes it's these scenarios only when we're put in a situation where we think, okay, here's where I need to show my loyalty to God. This is something major. We recognize this major event where Potiphar's wife came on to Joseph. And he maintained his loyalty to God. But even in those things that are so much smaller, in our everyday life, even the small things, whether it be a foul word, whether it be choosing to watch something that we should not watch, something that we might not look at as great as the sin that he could have committed with Potiphar's wife. But even through all of it, every little bit of it, Joseph maintained his loyalty. I think that's a valuable lesson for each and every one of us. Regardless of what we don't have, regardless of the depth of the low, maintain your loyalty. Regardless of how high God might exalt you, don't become prideful. Maintain your loyalty. Despite what you could have, those things that are not ours to have, when the temptation comes, maintain your loyalty. And despite what you might lose, maintain your loyalty. What's your life look like as it pertains to loyalty to God this morning? Even in this past week, we might not have experienced highs and lows even near what Joseph experienced in this short time frame. But if we're honest with ourselves, sometimes it takes even less for us to falter. Sometimes it takes so much less for us to fall short of the glory of God. The question is, will we be loyal and turn back to Him? You have that opportunity this morning. If you have sin in your life and you recognize it, guess what? It does separate you from God. If you continue to live in that sin, it is something that separates you from your Almighty God, and you have the opportunity to do something about it this morning. If you've not yet been baptized as a believer in Christ, we would like to help you with that also. Whatever your need might be this morning, please, if you have need, let it be known as together we stand and as we sing.